I am here to tell you about why anonymization is in existential peril and what we can all do about it. But first, we've got to ask, what is anonymization? There are a bunch of different ways to answer that question. We could go look at the GDPR. We could ask what the regulators in California think. Today, I'm going to answer it by asking, what do our users think? What do they expect when we say we anonymize data? What promise did we make to them? So I've got up here a bunch of different examples about the kind of things that we say to our users about anonymization. And they all basically say the same thing. They say, we're going to take the user's data, and we're going to do something to it. We're going to transfer it. We're going to store it. We're going to keep it longer. We're going to share it with someone. And this thing that we're doing, it might be harmful to the user. The user might not like it. They might think it violates their privacy. But we've made it safe through anonymization. The anonymization means that the data can't harm the user. The user does not have to worry. Unfortunately, over the past 20 years, we've broken this promise again and again and again. And the public has noticed, and regulators have noticed. There's a growing skepticism, which we heard earlier, that anonymization works. People think that if you say you're anonymizing data, you're either wrong or you're lying. And that's really imperils our ability to use anonymization going forward. If users don't believe that anonymization works, they won't give us their data. And if nobody believes that anonymization works, lawmakers and regulators won't give us the opportunity to continue to use anonymization either. You can see up here, our friends at the FTC are already saying that anonymization often doesn't work. And I don't really like the direction that this is trending. Why do I care? Why should you care? Well, anonymization can work. And when it does work, it's incredibly valuable. We can do things that are really, really useful to society. Up on screen is a project that I worked on. We were able to release data on the browsing habits of Wikipedia users sliced by country, which, as you can imagine, has some sensitivity. And we were able to do it in a way that effectively protected their privacy and produced data that researchers have been asking for years. I'm really proud of this data release, but I'm worried that we're headed for a world where a release like this won't be possible. So how do we avoid that? How do we make sure that we can keep doing this sort of valuable work? Well, the one thing that the skeptics are right about is that anonymization does fail a lot. So why does that happen? Well, imagine that you, a privacy practitioner, are trying to anonymize a data set. You probably want to use the industry standard anonymization technique. But as the laugh that I heard maybe indicates, there isn't one. There's no industry standard. There's just a list of a bunch of different options. Some of them are good options. Some of them not so much. But people use all of them. So which one should you use? Well, let's say you're looking at one of these options. How do you evaluate it? How do you know if it's good for your use case? There's no standard way to do that either. You just have to sort of figure it out, use your best judgment, guess, and maybe come back in 10 years and see if it broke. This creates two problems. First, for folks like us who want to do right by users, it's really, really hard to get it right. We are going to make mistakes. And that's not our fault. That's just a consequence of trying to operate without enough information to make good decisions. But there are also a lot of people who don't care about protecting users. They just want to do the bare minimum that they can get away with. And in a world without clear standards, they can get away with really, really minimal amounts. You might be thinking, OK, we've got a bunch of actors, some of them well-intentioned, some of them not. We need to get them all to meet some sort of minimal standard. Maybe that's a job for the government. The good news is that governments around the world have opinions on what you have to do to anonymize data. The bad news is that they all contradict each other. The EU can't agree what anonymization is, and the US can't even agree what it's called. I really recommend you go watch the recording from Katharina Koerner's talk from PEPR last year if you want a deeper dive into this question. But the takeaway, at least for me, is that this is a mess, and it is not looking like it's going to get resolved anytime soon. The regulators are not going to save us on this one, which pretty much just leaves us. We are the industry, and if we want something to be industry standard, we can make it so. I'll point out that this is kind of what happened in security. There's no top-down, or there are some top-down communications, but there's also just a lot of people coalescing around practices that work. And I'll point out that nobody believes that good security is impossible. So how do we get to that world where we have industry standards? The first step, I think, is we need to agree on how to evaluate anonymization techniques. That's sort of the foundational question here. If we try to talk about specific techniques before we've agreed on how to evaluate them, we're not going to get anywhere productive. So for the rest of my talk, I have 5 principles that I think you should use when evaluating anonymization strategies. All right, so first, I think we all need to approach any anonymization technique with skepticism. Take the position that it is not anonymized until you are convinced otherwise. There's a strong temptation to look at a complicated technique, and these techniques are frequently very complicated, and say, well, I don't really see how to attack that. That seems like it's probably fine. I call this anonymization by vibes. But unfortunately, just because we don't see how to attack the system doesn't mean that somebody else isn't going to be able to. The security community and the crypto community learned this a long time ago. It's a lot harder to build a system that nobody can attack than it is to build a system that you can't attack. So ask yourself, why does this make the data safe? But really, why? If you can't answer, maybe it doesn't. I really think this is the story behind most of the anonymization failures we've seen. Just people didn't really interrogate the techniques used. If you look back in hindsight, they look really weak. And I'm guessing it's probably just because nobody thought about it very hard. The good news is that's really easy to fix. OK, so you did some thinking. And maybe you went and you did some threat modeling. That seems like a reasonable type of thinking to do. You came up with a big, long list of assumptions about who your attackers are likely to be, what sort of techniques they're likely to use, what sort of background information they have. What happens if some of those assumptions are wrong? Because some of them probably are going to be wrong. It's really, really hard to model these things. With attacker capabilities, the temptation is always going to be to underestimate. This is the I don't see it, I don't see how to break it problem all over again. And we like to think that attackers maybe aren't that sophisticated or aren't that motivated. But have you considered grad students? Or data brokers? There are some folks out there who are quite sophisticated and very intensely motivated to break your anonymization. Background information is also very hard to model. There's a lot of anonymization techniques that rely on categorizing your data into identifiers and quasi-identifiers and sensitive data. And all of this requires you to sort of tell which things an attacker is going to know and which they aren't. But we don't really have a good way to model that. It's kind of like asking, is this data point on the internet somewhere? I don't know how to answer that question. Similarly, we'd like to imagine that the attacker is a stranger to our users, but often the worst attackers are really, really close to the people that they're trying to attack and know a lot about them. I'm thinking in particular of perpetrators of intimate partner violence, like we've heard about at PEPR in years past. To give a brief example here, suppose that you're running a library and you want to release a data set of websites that people visit on the library computers. And you think, well, the number of books that you've checked out is not a very sensitive attribute. We want to sort of compare offline reading habits to online reading habits, so we'll key the data set by that. And you're going to be right most of the time, but the number of books that you checked out last month is something that a close partner might know. And your anonymization scheme is going to work for most people, but maybe not for the person who needs it most. I think the takeaway here is that techniques that depend on modeling are only as good as that modeling, and your modeling is never going to be perfect. I think the only solution here is to use techniques that don't rely on the modeling assumptions that you make. techniques that work against a diverse array of attackers with many different capabilities. Another thing I see people do a lot in this space is you take some data and you process it, and then you release it to the data consumer. And you put some restrictions on what the consumer is allowed to do with that data. Maybe they can't run certain queries. Maybe they can only run certain queries. This might be a policy that's written down somewhere. There might be a technical system to enforce it. There might not. If they could do whatever they wanted to the data set, they might be able to attack it, but they're not allowed to. I think this is a valid way to protect data, but I don't think it's anonymization. There's two fundamental issues here. The first is philosophical. We said that the user didn't have to worry when we anonymize data, but there's plenty for the user to worry about here. Is the recipient, the data consumer, are they trustworthy? Will they follow the governance scheme? Is the governance good enough to prevent abuse? I'll note that regulators and laws usually exempt anonymous data from data protection, but we're still doing data protection here that doesn't quite seem to line up. There's also a practical concern. Can you keep out hackers? Can the data consumer protect against malicious insiders? Even if the data consumer is just as good at security as you are, if they're outside your organization and you've made a second copy of the data, you've doubled your chance of a data breach. And most of these systems rely on humans to work. And humans make mistakes all the time. It's just how we are. So we promised the users that the anonymous data couldn't harm them, but this data definitely still could. Given all of the data breaches that we've seen and the governance failures like Cambridge Analytica, I really think trying to do this is playing with fire. Some anonymization techniques can fail catastrophically when you do a next release. A great example is k-anonymity. Suppose we're a hospital, and we want to release a data set of patients keyed by zip code. This is k-anonymous with a pretty reasonable k. It's a k of 101, seems good. And say we're also considering releasing another data set that slices by cancer diagnosis as well. We want to find out geographical trends in cancer. This data set is also k-anonymous. But if you put them together, they're not. The k-anonymity guarantee failed catastrophically. So to protect against this, we have to consider every single release, every single past release whenever we want to do a new one. That's easy when we're only looking at these two data sets. But what if you're on data set 200? Or these two data sets are being produced by two different teams that don't talk to each other? I really think that if we rely on techniques that have these catastrophic failure probabilities, we are setting ourselves up to failure, and we are setting our anonymization up to fail. Instead, we should prefer techniques that have what's called composability, where you have a guarantee that a next release won't make privacy that much worse. Things degrade gradually rather than failing catastrophically. And finally, you have got to be able to explain your anonymization technique. There's a few reasons for this. First off, if your technique breaks when you explain it in public, it probably wasn't a very good technique to start with. Security has a term for this. It's called security through obscurity, and it's generally a giant red flag. Peer review is how we make sure that what we're doing is good and works. I'll also point out that if you're relying on keeping the details secret, you're doing governance again, just on the technique rather than on the data. But there's a few more reasons as well. Your data consumers need to know how you process the data to be able to do good science. And also, we need to be able to share with each other to be able to develop standards and come to an agreement on what is good and what is not. And finally, we need to be able to share with the public if we're going to build any of that trust back. So those are my 5 principles. It is possible to do this well. People are already doing it well. I highlighted the Wikimedia release before. I also am very pleased with the Census 2020 release. There are people doing this well. We need to make sure that we all do it well and that we can all agree on how to do it well. There is a long road to rebuilding trust, but let's get started.